Right, so welcome um, to this discussion and virtual walkthrough. This is the kind of thing we do now during this time of the pandemic. And we will be focusing today on medieval women. And I'm joined by Alexandra Gajewski today. And my name is Jana Gajdošová, I should say that for those that don't know me. And I work at Sam Fogg. I'm a medieval specialist, and I worked on this exhibition, Medieval Women, Subjects and Makers of Art. But I don't consider myself in any way an expert on medieval women. So I'm really happy that Alexandra Gajewski is here joining me, because after I do the walkthrough, we will answer these questions together. And Alexandra is the reviews editor at the Burlington Magazine, and she's worked on medieval women, publishing in, I think, several different places, but she worked on this particular project that we've highlighted during the roundtable, which was called Reassessing the Roles of Women as Makers of Medieval Art and Architecture. And that was a project that went on for about 5 years. But I think when you work on something like that, it probably stays in the back of your mind for a very long time.
Very true.
Yeah. Right. So I think I will start my walkthrough and introduce you to this exhibition that we put on at Sam Fogg. And it's so unfortunate because we've prepared for this exhibition for a very long time, and we talked about it even longer than that. And so it's a bit of a shame that we had to do it during the pandemic. But nevertheless, I think doing it virtually taught us quite a lot about exhibitions in a pandemic, and doing things in a different way and thinking outside the box. And when we started having these conversations about medieval women, what we really wanted to show was that there is this incomplete story that we have when it comes to medieval art, and women were fully integrated into this story of art. And I hope that many of the objects that you see will be able to illustrate that that women had this important role, and they really reveal to us a little bit of this history. And so I have a video that I've split up into 4 segments, and each of the segments represents a different part of the gallery. So whenever we curate an exhibition, we sort of think about the gallery in 4 parts. The ground floor, and then the blue room upstairs in the back, and then the upstairs is divided into kind of 2 parts. And in each of these parts, I will highlight 1 or 2 objects that I will be focusing on. And so I'm playing the video now. And for those that know our gallery, probably recognize that this is the ground floor. And when you enter the exhibition, you are immediately confronted by objects that fall into both of the categories that we're highlighting: subjects and makers of art. One of the most striking examples, actually, that you could just see in the back is this tapestry, which was made in we think in St. Walburga, a convent in Eichstätt. But just from this very short clip, what you can see is that the exhibition has a large scope of styles and time periods. And you have everything here just by entering the ground floor, from panel paintings to textiles, miniatures, sculpture, and so on. And the exhibition also has manuscripts, which you will see towards the end of the presentation, and stained glass. But on this ground floor, I would just like to, I think, yes, okay. I would just like to focus first on this object, which is a birth tray that was made in Tuscany in the second half of the 15th century. And it's wooden, and it's polychromed and gilded. Now, in late medieval and Renaissance Italy, material culture that was associated with births was really sophisticated and quite rich. Births were, and pregnancies as well, were quite dangerous for both the mother and the baby. And so whenever there was a healthy birth, this was a really celebrated event. And mothers would therefore be congratulated with various types of food and with gifts. And this object is a birth tray that would have been a gift of this type. It's called in Italy a deschi da parto, or a birth tray, and it was extremely fashionable, especially in Tuscany during the 15th century. Now, these objects were used literally as trays that would have contained gifts of food or drink, and would have been subsequently then hung on walls, just as we have done in our gallery. And I just have here a slide, which is a fresco in Prato Cathedral, and it shows the birth of the Virgin. This is painted in the first half of the 15th century by Paolo Uccello. And so you can see, when you look at the image on the left, Saint Anne lying in this very large bed in the background. And just in front of her, there is a sort of attendant who's cuddling the Virgin Mary, the baby Virgin Mary. But around these two mini scenes, you have lots of other attendants, lots of other women that are present at this birth. And everyone's doing something, and a lot of them are carrying things. You can see on the left, this woman that's running down really quickly down the stairs, and she's carrying what looks like two bowls. But I just zoomed in on a woman that actually stands behind the bed, and you can see her on the right, and she's carrying one of these wooden round trays, and she brings food and drink to Saint Anne. And so this is this type of object, a kind of a wooden tray that would have been used to carry things. And these trays were commissioned, but often they were also made sort of ready-made with subjects that were appropriate for the occasion. And so here what we have is the baby Moses, who's subjected to the trial by fire. And although cheaper versions of these birth trays were available for less wealthy people, this example with its polychromy and its gilding would have almost certainly been owned by someone extremely wealthy. So we kind of start with births. And then we move on to an object that you may have noticed in the video, which is a sculpture of Saint Avia, or the jailed woman, as we call her. And I think this object really encapsulates what we all feel like during this pandemic. And so I think it was an object that, when we put it online, everyone was quite entertained by it. And it's a life-sized head of a woman, which is behind bars, and it's sculpted from limestone. Now, we don't actually know the context of this sculpture, but it would have been almost certainly incorporated into a wall. And we can tell because all the sides of the sculpture are unfinished except for the front. So we think it would have created almost like a niche-like, object that it would have been probably on the exterior of a building. And we identify the woman as Saint Avia, who was a virgin martyr who was imprisoned for her beliefs. And the particular part of her story that's often highlighted is that when she was imprisoned, she miraculously received communion, and I have another slide here, from the Virgin Mary, who appeared to her with an entourage of angels. And this is the moment in her story that's often highlighted in manuscripts, and her cult became extremely popular in northern France in the late Middle Ages, which is why we actually place this sculpture into northern France in the late Middle Ages. And this actually also coincides with the style of the architecture and of the sculpture. But it's also an object, I should say, that we've never seen anything like it. And so if anyone has any idea, or if anyone's seen anything like this object, it would be really interesting to actually hear from you. Saint Avia is found in manuscripts. So this is from a manuscript that's in the Morgan Library, and there are a couple of other depictions of her. She's almost always shown through a window behind bars, but I don't know of any stone sculpture. So this object is a unique thing, I think. And then when let's see if this plays. when we go upstairs, we come to an area where we have grouped 4 sculptures, and this was quite unintentional, but all of them come from southern Germany or Switzerland. And these 2 busts that you see here, you might recognize because we use them as sort of our poster child of the exhibition. And then we have here this wooden Virgin and Child, which I will speak about in a little bit. But I just want to stop at these striking reliquary busts. We've actually spoke about these. We highlighted them as our object of the week. So I don't want to get too much into it, but since we use them as the ad in the Burlington Magazine and as an ad in the art newspaper and as our kind of banners and things, we kind of use this image constantly. Some of you might recognize it. And I just wanted to sort of tell you the story behind that. So we used the back of this particular reliquary bust's head as the advertising. So this image that you see in the center. And it was taken by by our photographer in the gallery, and we all really loved this image. And so it seemed a bit like a long shot at first, but then we submitted it, and I think it was really well received. And I don't want to sort of delve too much into the meaning behind this, because it was really just because we loved the way the photograph turned out. But once we started thinking about it, it felt quite right, because here you have this gilded reliquary bust, which just seemed so appropriate for us as a gallery, which deals with medieval art. And at the same time, the long, beautiful hair immediately seems to have grasped the sort of feminine theme of the show. And somehow the fact that the face of this virgin martyr was completely obscured or concealed also felt appropriate, because it really highlighted or spoke of the absence of knowledge that many people have about medieval women, but also about the misconceptions about medieval women and about their sort of incomplete stories. And I wonder what Alexandra thinks about that when she comes back on. But I want to, in this section, I really want to highlight this object, which is a sculpted image of the Virgin and Child. And this is localized to the city of Constance or its vicinity in southern Germany. And it's dated to about 1310, so the very beginning of the 14th century. And the sculpture belongs to a group of objects that were made in southern Germany at a time or an age that's called the age of the Andachtsbilder, or as that's defined, a monumental devotional image that's psychologically charged to communicate an emotional state and, in some instances, transport the soul to God. Now, the veneration of the Virgin is something that I just wanted to mention because it grew quite rapidly, but at the same time, it also changed throughout the Middle Ages. And this is something that we discussed during our round table a little bit. There was a publication on this group of sculptures that was written by Caroline Jurosek. And she worked on this topic of these sculptures that were produced in southern Germany at the end of the 13th and early 14th century. She noted that this area of Europe became the center of mysticism at this time. And she also said that remarkable percentages of women started joining formal monastic institutions at this time. And many of them were highly educated. They came from upper classes, and so they would have had quite a bit of sway. And they contributed, according to her research, to instructive mystical texts, and they had quite an impact on the evolution of devotional images, such as this sculpture. And so what we see changing at this time is that we move away from the sort of formal Sede Sapientiae image, where you have the Virgin and Child enthroned, and the Virgin is often wearing a large, heavy crown, and the Christ child is a miniature adult rather than a baby. and they both kind of stare out into the distance. Now with this image, there is a shift that can already be noticed. So the Virgin does not wear a crown, and she's here depicted having this intimate relationship with her baby, and she's holding the orb in her hand, obviously, but it also looks like a toy. It looks like she's sort of playing with her child. And although the polychromy, we have to imagine that this would have been obviously polychromed and gilded, possibly, and all of that's lost, which is some information that, you know, we are losing in this image. But nevertheless, I think it is a very kind of sweet image, and it marks that change. And here I just have another image where you can just see the back of this sculpture, where just if you look at the bottom of the back of the throne, you can see an inscription there. And that inscription just basically says that the sculpture was found in a village called Egg, and that it probably originated in the now destroyed castle of Alt-Laubenberg, which is in southern Germany, which supports our localization. And the sculpture was actually published several times, most notably in 1951 by Alfred Schadler. Now, walking away from this exhibition, I want to continue to talk about depictions of the Virgin Mary. And I want to just focus on an object that you just see here, you just saw in the previous shot in the back, this sculpture here. Here we have an image which is quite different from the one we just saw. It comes from Germany, but from the northern part, so probably from somewhere near Cologne, and it's dated to the middle of the 14th century. Now, as I said, the veneration of the Virgin Mary in the Middle Ages was immense, and the images of her changed and evolved as her cult grew. And in the late 13th century, we have the birth of a curious object called the Shrine Madonna. Now, at first glance, when you look at this particular object, it just looks like those traditional Sede Sapientiae images that I just mentioned when I talked about the previous object. So you have the Virgin enthroned. She's got a large crown on her head, which is now lost, and there may have been actually metal attachments at the top. And she's holding on with her left hand to a miniature adult, which is actually the Christ child, and they both kind of stare into the distance. But when you look closely, what you can see is that there is actually a seam that runs down vertically down the Virgin's chest, and this allows her chest to open up like the wings of an altarpiece, which would have revealed a further image, and sometimes in some instances a sculpture inside. Now, in this example, just as in the last one, the polychromy and possibly gilding and possibly metal attachments are lost. But we can imagine that the sculpture would have been brightly painted and perhaps polychromed, and that it may have revealed an image of the Trinity. And I say this because many images of the Shrine Madonna that survive have an image of the Trinity inside. And so I can show you just another example here. And this is from Nuremberg, from the Germanisches Museum in Nuremberg. And this is dated to the late 14th century, so a couple of decades after our example. And in terms of context, we have to imagine that these types of sculptures would have been placed on altars and would have been opened on important feast days. So it would have functioned almost like altar pieces that had wings, and those wings would have opened and closed during various parts of the year. What's interesting to me about this object, when I started researching it, I found that that these types of objects became quite problematic in the 15th century, and this was for two reasons. The first was that it placed the Virgin at the center of sacred doctrine. Jean Gerson wrote about this. He was the chancellor of the University of Paris, and he died in 1429, so he was around in the early 15th century. And I found a quote from a letter that he wrote when he visited a monastery in Paris, and he saw a shrine Madonna on the altar there. And he says, "The Trinity in its womb, as if the entire Trinity took flesh in the Virgin Mary." And so you can see that there would have been problems with this. And the second reason that these representations became quite problematic was that it transformed the body of the Virgin, which was normally seen as a symbol of purity and modesty, into an object that was cut down in the center, opened, and revealed. And as a result of this, by the early modern period, most of these statues were banned, destroyed, or glued shut, which is the reason that not many survived. And if you want to know more about this, a scholar called Alina Gertzman actually worked on this, and she has a book that's called Worlds Within. And then the last part of the exhibition is the Blue Room. And so I will just play this clip. And so for those that know our gallery, you probably noticed this windowless room that we have in the back, where we display manuscripts, but also stained glass. Here we have our 4 manuscripts of the show. All of the manuscripts in the exhibition were made for women. And we know this because the prayers are written in the feminine. But I would just like to focus on this particular example, which is a ceremonial antonary that comes from the monastery of St. Mary Magdalene in Siena. And this is dated to roughly 1500, so probably from the late 15th, maybe up to 1504. The manuscript was created for and by the nuns of St. Mary Magdalene, and it gives us a glimpse into the daily life of the convent in late medieval Siena. The book includes, it's divided into sort of 3 parts, and one of those parts are chapters on confession, dress and bedding, eating and drinking, and the election of the abbess. And this part of the manuscript I find really fascinating because it goes into quite a lot of detail about, the way that these nuns, the rules that these nuns are meant to follow. Sometimes talking about things like the way that they're meant to walk into the refectory before they eat, and what happens if a nun laughs during supper, and so it's quite actually entertaining, and it really gives you a glimpse, a kind of a window into this monastery. The manuscript also has a tonary which sets forth the various musical settings for using Gregorian chants. And it's actually interesting that this manuscript comes from Siena, because we know quite a bit about convents in Siena. And we also know that huge numbers of women lived in convents in Siena at this time. Some scholars argue that up to 12% of Sienese women lived in convents in the late Middle Ages. And we also know that the nuns of the convent of St. Mary Magdalene copied and illuminated religious books. We have 2 examples that are found in documents that were made for the Ospedale della Scala and the Opera del Duomo in Siena, and those were made by the nuns in 1440 and 1470. And the manuscript is also covered. You probably saw in the exhibition, we actually display it closed rather than open. And the reason for this is because it's covered by the original binding. And the back of the binding has this beautiful image of the patron saint of this convent, St. Mary Magdalene. And the painting really shows that whoever was the master at work here, he was definitely a Sienese artist, because you can definitely see the similarities between this painting, the style of this painting, and painting in Siena. Here I am showing you, for example, Luca Signorelli's 2 paintings, where you can actually see the St. Mary Magdalene on the left. And I leave you actually with this image before we get into the Q&A, which is an image of Christine de Pizan's book of the City of Ladies, because I thought you know, I can't not put this image in. And I think I will just wait for Alexandra to come back, and we can talk about the exhibition, about general questions relating to women. But let me just see what questions we actually have submitted.
Jana, did you see there was a really interesting question already by Pauline Velge, I think?
Okay.
That picks up on something that Jeffrey mentioned in the panel talk, when he said that when he started to study in 1981, there was hardly anything he could find, any publications he could find on medieval nuns. And the question Pauline asks, why is that the case? Is it, and she rightly says, it's not that there weren't powerful, wealthy female convents. So it is definitely not the case that as such there's less information about women than there is as men. Especially when we talk about monasteries, that's not the case about nuns. So I think it is important to point out and to remember now that before the 1980s, it is true that people were simply not finding women interesting. It seems incredible now, but this was brought home to me very much when I was researching on women around the year 1000 in Lorraine, so in that area between the Empire, the German Empire, and France in the Middle Ages. And at that stage, the female connections were so important. If you married the daughter of the emperor, that meant something to a local count or duke. So the family connections and the children, you can't understand the history really without knowing who married who and what the women did. But the author of a book, a wonderful book written in the 19th century, some of the greatest scholars at that time, 3 volumes, 3 thick volumes. The author of that book had 2 pages in the 3 volumes on the women, not just nuns. This is in history, the women in history in Lorraine. And he introduced it by saying, and he clearly meant it, it was heartfelt, by saying, I'm so sorry, I would love to say more about women at this time in Lorraine, but there's just nothing interesting to say. And he clearly meant it. From our point of view, it seems incredible. So I think the mindset that of scholars from the start of the discipline in the late 19th century until after the war is something that we have to keep in mind when we look at what there is on the shelves about medieval women in general and nuns in particular.
Now, it is interesting. I was actually listening to the roundtable once more, and it's interesting because Madeline, right in the beginning, also says that, you know, we do have this very limited view or this limited story, not only because of the documents or, you know, that have been lost or whatever, but also because we tend to focus on just 2 groups, the aristocratic group and then also the clerical group. And so there is quite a large you know, population, you know, all the women that are working that we just don't know very much about.
I think in that case, what is important is that archaeology has helped so much. I think one thing also is worth perhaps pointing out again, that distinction in the Middle Ages was not so much between men and women, not between suppressed women and powerful men. The distinction in the Middle Ages was much more between status. If you were aristocracy, you would feel separated from whatever was the poor, the lower classes. And in terms of rights and possibilities, it was really in which status you were born was the main question before whether you were a woman or a man. So it is indeed about women and men of the lower classes that we know very little from documentary evidence in the Middle Ages.
I'm just looking at some of the other questions.
I love the image you put up, and I agree. It's a wonderful image to finish your wonderful tour of that exhibition with. It is worth pointing out that it is entire fantasy, perhaps.
Yeah.
Women were on building sites. We know quite a lot now about women on building sites. And only recently, in fact, after our panel talk, I heard about a case of women doing wall paintings on a building site. So we do have that evidence, but upper class women would have not have carried stones with their crowns, their little crowns on their head and their best dresses on.
Yeah, yeah. No, but it's interesting that you say this example, and it's something that I think was pointed out during the panel quite a bit, that, you know, we keep, as we do research, and when you have this in the back of your mind, you notice these so-called, for that were, you know, for a long time, so-called exceptions. And you know, every time you hear about another so-called exception, it really adds another kind of piece to the puzzle. And it's something that kind of was discussed, you know, and even, you know, Madeline had that example of, was it, I can't remember the name now, a noblewoman in Nuremberg who was paying for some glazing, and that she was very directly involved with the mason, or sorry, with the glazier. And, you know, that she writes in this letter saying that, you know, you're using the wrong red and Christ looks like a fat priest and so on. And so I thought, you know, this is something I hadn't heard about before. But just to go back to your point about archaeology, in our exhibition, we actually have a pot. And, you know, of course, we have no documentary evidence for this, but pottery in England, especially this type of pottery, when you look at, I think it's towards the end of our catalog, if you go on our website, you have this pot that was made in Brill. And we know that the pottery was made in households. So often women and children would have helped. And this particular pot that we have has these fingerprints all over it. You know, at the top, you have these two fingerprints, and they're really, really delicate and small. And so when we looked at it, we thought, well, could this be a woman that's making it? And so that just reminded me of that example. I have here a question on our Q&A, and I have actually a stack of books on my desk that I prepared as I was looking forward to this. And I have a question that asks, what are your 3 favorite books on the topic? Alexandra, I don't know if you can answer first, and then I can add to it.
Well, as we were talking to Jeffrey on the other day on the panel, I have to say that some of my favorite books on women, and especially on nuns, are by Jeffrey, who really has contributed so much to the question. Nuns as artists is such a classic. But on the topic of nuns, I do like also, I mentioned Jane Schulenburg in my talk, in my contribution, and she also is somebody I admire greatly, and whose books are a wonderful read as well. Forgetful of Their Sex, Female Sanctity and Society, is a really good read, especially if you want to know about women in convents at the early stage, and the connection between sanctity and female status.
Yeah, I have to agree. I really loved reading Jeffrey's book, Nuns as Artists. And one book that he actually mentions during the talk, when he's talking about, you know, some of the first women that started looking at medieval women, was Eileen Power, her book on medieval women. So, on medieval women. And I actually really liked a book that you, Alexandra, pointed me to, which is called The Subversive Stitch. I just think it's such a great title, and I think it was such a great actually book to look through. It's on embroidery. It's called Subversive Stitch: Embroidery in the Making of the Feminine.
In fact, I was just going to mention that too. About Eileen Power, I read her too, and I think it's still, these books are still on the shelves in libraries, and it is still worth reading them. Of course, we've in many ways moved on. We found out much more. As you said, in particular, we found out that we thought were the occasional exceptions are actually quite a rule. But I still think they make a good read, and they're a good introduction to the subject. And Roshika Parker, of course, is now also a classic. She's wonderful. I mean, the title is great, but the book is just as good, and it's still widely available. So that's also, I think, a good read.
Yeah, and the last one that I should highlight, which I think I learned probably the most from, because I was exposed to it before I knew we were starting this, is the book that you published during your project, Reassessing the Roles of Women as Makers of Medieval Art and Architecture. I think, the essays there are just, because they're quite short, you can sort of read them in bits and they reveal so much. And I think Teresa Martin's introduction is just, it's so well written, but it really gets to the point, and it asks all these important questions and, answers them as best as she can. And I think that's a great place to start. And you can actually read a lot of it on Google Books for free. So there you go, a tip.
Fantastic.
So,
oh, sorry, Jana.
No, I was just looking through questions, but if you have,
Pippa Roberts asked a question which I think is very important. Can or should we assume it was women scribes and illuminators working to create manuscripts within convents, etc.? And the answer has to be a resounding yes. Both without convent walls, we have the evidence. I think also that Jeffrey mentioned evidence there, but we have written evidence in manuscripts which actually talk about where women scribes and illuminators have signed, have mentioned, give their name, say that they've made this. So we know that they were illuminating within the convents, but of course women were also working, laywomen were also working in usually within family context. If there was a family workshop, women would absolutely be expected to contribute. And we know from that through the research of the Rouses who have published on that subject. So I think it's an important question, this.
Yeah. And we have another question here, which actually states that Patricia Kidd asks whether we could talk a little bit more about women as makers of art, and do we have any comments on the making of art in a domestic setting? She didn't know about the round table, she says, but this is actually recorded, Patricia. You can go to our website. It's actually also linked on the London Art Week website. So when you went to register, there was actually a link you could click to view the round table. But if not, if you just go to our website, it's on the Learn section. We have this recorded, so you can view that there. But this topic of makers of art is such a huge topic, and it's something that we try to tackle during the round table. But of course, it's something that you could probably talk weeks about. It's such a huge topic. But I'll let Alexandra answer it. But I will just say that I like that the word maker is being used more and more, because I think it's something we went with rather than saying artists or patrons or separating them. And it's really, something that we were inspired to do through Teresa Martin's definition of it, which is, and your definition of it in the project, which includes artists, patrons, and recipients as having roles in the making of art.
Of course, it's the medieval word. Sorry. It is the inscription that we get is a name usually, and then hoc fecit, made this. So facere is the medieval word. Artists were makers. So we're actually using a very appropriate term there, I think. It is also like artists themselves. It's not non-gendered. And the question was about the making of art, women making art in a domestic setting. This, again, we know more about the making of art by women in convents than we know about making of art in a domestic setting, at least for the early Middle Ages. In the later Middle Ages, in a domestic setting, it is really the workshop context where we get information. As I already mentioned, illuminators, but also other types of workshops. where women would be expected to join and work with their man, alongside the man. And we know quite a lot about that. Did you see, Jana, there's a wonderful comment from Anne Sacre about interest in women's history, and she recalls a conference at University College in the 1980s in London, when the moderator announced the next paper to present it would be about 17th century Dutch women. Many of the male art historians present simply got up and left the room to have tea.
Gosh.
I think that's a wonderful recollection. Thank you for sharing that, Anne.
Yeah. And an anonymous attendee is saying that they saw a glimpse of the tapestry or embroidery. It's actually a tapestry on the ground floor. It's the one that I mentioned. This is thought to have been made by the nuns of St. Walburga in Eichstätt, and it's dated to about 1500. And it's something I didn't actually focus on because we have it's had quite a lot of press already, and so I didn't want to sort of choose that as an object because we've talked about it quite a bit, and it was actually in our tapestry, in our textiles show a while back. But if you would like to know more information about that, you can download our catalog when you go on our website. You will see the medieval women right on our landing page, and you can download the catalog there. And there's a quite a lengthy entry in our catalog.
Catherine Leitario asks, what was the second book you mentioned after Eileen Powers? Is it Roshika Parker? That one? The Subversive Stitch?
Parker, no. You mentioned something else before that.
I mentioned Jane Schulenburg.
Yeah, I think that's probably the one.
And the title is Forgetful of Their Sex. There's also a question by Louise Reeds. Can we assume women entered the convents in these vast numbers willingly? Very good question. Yeah, Jeffrey talks about that in the panel, doesn't he? He mentions that the situation for many women in convents was in fact better than in the castles as laywomen, because of course they were safe from the dangers of giving birth to children. They were well looked after. They were eating healthily, one assumes, from all we know. So in fact, going into convent was not necessarily a bad choice. But despite that, I do remember on another occasion, Jeffrey telling me that he had discovered a letter from a nun who was complaining bitterly about being stuck in the convent and wanting to get out. Of course, that existed too. But people, daughters were sent, not necessarily asked whether they wanted to or not, into convents, and yes, in large numbers, and most of them stuck with it.
Yeah, and I think one of the other things that Jeffrey mentions is also that, you know, when medieval marriages, especially in the aristocratic circles, they were not kind of love matches, but they were, you know, arranged marriages. And so going into a convent where you can have, in many instances, much more agency and,
indeed,
you know, a sort of freedom in some way, was actually quite an attractive option to have.
There's a very interesting question by C. Lash. Was there any actual genuine economic benefit to women makers? Was there an economic benefit to the nuns? What was their motivation as makers? I think that's such a good question. And in fact, even in the early Renaissance, women could not yet earn money, for example, as painters. So the question probably has to be answered negative. If women worked in workshop practices, of course, the economic benefit would have been for the whole family and the workshop, including the women. Women in convents were usually making books or embroideries for not for economic benefit, but either for their own convent or to be given as gifts. The benefit, of course, would have been another one. The benefit would have been a religious one. in that, for example, as Jeffrey also mentioned in the panel, women were not allowed at the altar, near the altar during Mass. But if, as a man, as a woman nun, you had embroidered the cope or the stole of the priest, and perhaps even stitched your name into it, for which we have examples, then you were practically there. So there were other benefits to be gained, not necessarily in terms of financial benefit.
It's interesting because one thing that Jeffrey Hamburger mentions in the roundtable is that, you know, when things were produced in an actual workshop where there was economic benefit, that they often complain that he notes something where these artists in a workshop are complaining about women in convents producing things because they see them as unfair competition.
Yes.
Which I thought was an interesting comment that he made and quite pertinent to what you were just saying.
Exactly.
I have a question here from Brian Gastel that's quite interesting. It says, is there any indication of how women operating as scribes or artists were trained by other women? In other words, would there have been artistic communities of practice within women's religious houses?
That's a very good question as well. And we can only assume that there were, if a convent was illuminating its own manuscripts or scribes, it would not be feasible for a male artist to come in to teach them. So it would have to be taught from women to women.
It's also interesting because it's also about, I suppose, when it comes to manuscripts, about looking at something else and copying it. And they would have had these libraries. And the last object that I showed, this ceremonial intonary from the convent of St. Mary Magdalene in Siena, we actually had a scholar who focuses on this area look at it. And she said that she was quite surprised because while the manuscript is quite clearly, it mentions Pope Pius III, is dated to the late 15th century, probably early 16th century. The script that's being used is a bit old-fashioned. And so that was quite interesting because she thought maybe it's a really old nun, you know, who's writing this, the first part of this manuscript. But it could also be that they're just, you know, copying something, or that, you know, so I just thought that was quite an interesting observation that she made there.
Yes, definitely.
Yeah, because she said that if she didn't know the content, you know, which clearly dates it, you know, to the very late 15th century, she would have dated it several decades earlier based on the style of the script.
Really fascinating.
Yeah. So Pippa asks, would women have embroidered Opus Anglicanum textiles, as embroidery seems to have been primarily a female occupation? And you, Alexandra, you mentioned this quite a bit. We talked about embroidery quite a bit during the roundtable. I wonder what you think.
That is a really interesting question. So by the time we have these complex gold stitches, such as Opus Anglicanum, we have to imagine that these are professionally done in textile kind of factories. And for all we know, there are a lot of men working in there. There are also women working in there, but it is by no means only women who do embroidery like Opus Anglicanum. This is very much now an occupation, a craft that is performed just as much, if not more so, by men. It's an interesting question, this, I think, because we associate embroidery with women. And it's not wrong that, because women did embroider all the time, and of course also do other things like weaving and working with their hands. remember that women were doing that from childhood onwards, really. But that is on one side. On the other side is that something like Opus Anglicanum would have been a craft. And so in that setting, it would have been impossible to have just women do it. And it was not just associated with women. It's very important, this, to remember, I think.
Yeah, and yeah, and also spinning.
Yeah, indeed.
London Art Week used this image of this pot that we have, which shows a woman spinning as the advertisement for this discussion of ours. And it was so appropriate because we talked about that quite a bit. And spinning was something that was done not only by women, but by everybody, because it seems that it took a very long time when you were spinning by hand. And so you can see in this image that if you go back to where you register, you can see this this jar that we have there, and the woman is kind of sitting with this I can't remember what it's called, stick spindle, I think, or and she's kind of spinning, and it took such a long time that supposedly people did it in between, you know, during the day, you know, in between tasks, as they went out with the animals, as they you know, were with the children. They would have just been kind of spinning constantly.
Another thing that I found really interesting is that it's quite well known when Jeanne d'Arc had her process in front of the judge, in order to show that she was really a woman, because of course she was accused of being a devil and not really being a woman. She said she had always been spinning, so that was her justification, really, to demonstrate that she was definitely female.
And we have a question here, which is to do with the polychromy on, I suppose, wooden sculpture, sometimes on stone as well, and when this would have been stripped of paint and gilding, and why this was done. I mean, I suppose, you know, many of the examples that we have still have traces. The two that I showed particularly don't have very visible traces of polychromy anymore. But a lot of the complete kind of stripping would have been done in the 19th and even 20th centuries, I would imagine, because paint would have flaked off and it wouldn't have looked very uniform. And so you either have to repaint it completely or strip it off of the paint. And this is something that happened in many ways, I think, with buildings, didn't it, Alexandra, where there was this favored look of seeing the masonry, which is something that you wouldn't have seen in the Middle Ages. You know, many of the churches would have been completely, you know, polychromed. But it's a very different sort of visual that we get today. And I think with the sculptures, it's probably a very similar story.
Yes, it's quite sad sometimes to see all the color gone, all the polychromy gone, especially the eyes, the lips would have been red. It made such a difference with figure sculpture. So
yeah.
I do very much like Christine Zebeda's question on how we should approach women in art history. And she quite rightly says that a lot of work is now done on patronage, but are there any other lenses, theoretical lenses, through which we can examine the way in which medieval women interacted with, she says, leveraged and shaped the material environment? I think that's so true, and to the point. Patronage does offer us such a rich field of inquiry and has been so important an approach recently. Also, of course, and there we come back to the fact that most of the women we look at are aristocratic women, and so patronage plays an important role. I think there are other lenses, though. One is sanctity. So some of the books we mentioned deal with that question. Schulenburg, for example, that is to say, how and when were women considered saints? Which women became saints? Could women saints be models for other women, other lay women, perhaps? I think that's something I've been working on a little bit, and I found that really interesting. And it includes art in the sense that women saints left were often associated with works of art, often with embroidery, and that were then handed through the generation. Or, of course, talking about makers, I think looking at women as artists, there's also still, I think, a lot of room for discovery and for research. And I think there's more, and I do agree that the emphasis on patronage, we have to find other ways of addressing women in the Middle Ages as well, alongside.
Yeah, and I was corrected here when I was trying to talk about spinning, but not successfully. So I was corrected to by Janet Snyder to say that the stick that I mentioned is actually called a distaff, and it's used for linen, and the kind of the balls at the bottom result from this wool that's spun. So just for anyone that's interested in that fact. And I think we're sort of nearing 6 o'clock, so I'm aware of the time, and I think we probably should stop there, unless if I see any other questions come through, I'll ask. But I think this was really great, and you know, it's such a strange thing because we've never done an exhibition on medieval women, and having done this, I feel that I want to do 10 more because, you know, I've just learned so much from it. And you know, having been able to do this roundtable discussion with yourself, Alexandra, but also with Jeffrey and Madeline, really kind of opened all of our eyes, you know, at the possibilities that we have here, and also at the sort of incomplete story. I mean, I don't know how you felt, you know, being someone who's researched this quite a bit, but I think you also mentioned that you learned, you know, of new examples and new exceptions, you know, from, you know, what Madeline and Jeffrey had said. And I think even with the objects in the exhibition, it's interesting because when you look at them through this feminine lens, you discover more that you didn't think of before, because some of the objects we've had in other exhibitions, but we didn't necessarily look at them through this feminine lens. And so I think there is a lot there that we might be missing because we're always assuming, as you appropriately said, that anonymous is a man.
Perhaps no longer.
Yeah.
Perhaps we stop that now. But I agree. There's so much work still to be done, and the exhibition shows that with the extraordinary objects in there. And as you said, Jana, we don't even know what all of them mean or what they represent. So there's definitely more to be found there. I was also so impressed with these questions we got, which were really engaged and engaging and interesting. So I hope we didn't overlook a question, but the ones we read really will keep with me as well and will get me thinking further. I think there's a lot of work still to be done on the subject.
Yes, and I should also say, just before we finish, that we our London Art Week will be sending a list of all the authors and titles that we mentioned today in a follow-up email to all the attendees who are interested. So if you have anything else that you would like us to send through, do let us know. And I should also say that there's another event that's taking place. It's Thomas Lawrence Coming of Age, and that's taking place on the 25th of March. And so you can probably just sign up through the London Art Week. You could register through the London Art Week website. And I think we'll probably end there. Thank you so much, Alexandra.
Oh, pleasure.